Totally fine. Oh, I just realized I didn't put an acknowledgement of country at the start because I thought you might do that.
Well, yes, I will start by
Okay.
welcoming everyone to today's SICS Research Seminar, and by acknowledging the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which CSU's campuses are located, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. So thanks everyone for coming. This is a SICS research seminar, so I'm hosting on behalf of the school's research committee. The session, as I said, is being recorded. It's helpful for us to keep a record of who's attending. So if you're outside the School of Information and Communication Studies, it'd be great if you could drop a quick note in the chat so we have a record of that, just saying whereabouts you're from. It's the standard seminar format, so around a 40-minute presentation. Kay, is that right? Yeah,
Yep,
good.
that's
I realised
fine.
we didn't check that. Sorry, I've been a bit remiss in my
That's
hosting duties.
okay. It's
So
been a
plenty of
busy
time for
time.
questions at the end. And normal format is to put the questions in the chat as we go, although Kay, you may be happy with people interrupting you. I don't know.
Yes, I am happy for people to interrupt if they
So
wish.
feel free to interrupt Kay. And today's seminar is titled Academics' Experience of Personal Learning Networks to Enhance Knowledge of Digital Pedagogies. And our presenter is Dr. Kay Oddone. Kay is a lecturer and course director in the School of Information and Communication Studies. She's been an educator for over 25 years, has taught at every level from prep to postgraduate. Do you get a special teaching award when you complete the set? Don't know.
Still waiting for that.
Her research interests include personal learning networks, networked and connected learning, and school libraries and teacher librarianship. So you should be able to share your screen, Kay, so I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today, and thank you to everyone who has come along in their busy day. I realize that it is a very busy time of the year. I'm just trying to make every time you share the screen, all of the little windows that you've got set up jump around. Well, at least they do for me. So yeah, since I shared that blurb with Simon, I have made tiny little adjustments to the title, but it's still the same thing. I'm going to be sharing my recent research on academics or university educators' experience of personal learning networks. And this is a presentation that I will be presenting next week also at the AARE conference in Adelaide. So if you have any feedback, I would welcome that too, because anything will help improve the presentation further and the research further. So let's get started. So this research is connected, draws connections from my PhD research, and which looked at teachers' experience of personal learning networks as a form of professional learning. And basically what my research has focused on up until now is the ways that people engage with informal learning through online social networks, and most specifically through personal learning networks. And I'll talk about what all that means, and what PLNs, what I'd mean when I talk about that in a moment. This research has focused on social configurations for learning, including communities and networks, and social learning theories such as network learning and connectivism. And I'll talk a bit more about those as well. So to get started, I'm really interested in social learning in communities and networks, and the ways in which technologies have impacted how we do this. And essentially, to understand the concept of a personal learning network, it's important that I explain how I've interpreted the concepts of communities and networks in social learning. So in a lot of research and in our everyday speaking, and we tend sometimes to use these two words to mean similar things or the same thing, but they're actually really well explained by Wenger when he says that they are two aspects of the social fabric which have different effects on learning potential. So when we think about social learning in communities and social learning in networks, they share similarities and they overlap. And that's what I've tried to demonstrate with this little diagram, that there are close parts of the fabric which have tight weaves, which would represent communities, and parts of the same fabric that have a looser weave, and they represent the network. So it's all one piece of fabric, but there are different aspects. And so just briefly, I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but just briefly, when we're talking about social learning, communities generally are developed around a shared interest or a passion or a goal, and they may be formal or informal. Usually what happens is there's a group of people who want to advance their knowledge, find out about something particularly. They all have a particular shared interest or a shared learning goal, and they come together and engage in that learning. And in doing so, they create a sense of identity as a community and shared practices. Generally, communities, when compared to networks, are tightly knit. There may be restrictions on participation. They're often created for a particular purpose or a particular time period, and they are based on connections similar to networks, which may be direct or indirect. But I think the most important part is that they are more tightly knit. Whereas networks, they generally they can be intentional, but they can also be serendipitous and just evolve without any planning at all. There's no commitment to a shared domain or sustained engagement. People come and go in learning networks as it pleases them, as it suits them, and participants create connections as they need them. So there's much less of that sense of identity among the group. There's much less shared practice. Usually they're typified by a web of information sources. So there's a potential for collective exploration, but no collective intention or design. So people may come together and collectively explore something, but that's not the goal of the network or the reason the network forms. And they are much more loosely structured. They're much more loosely organized, and really they just depend on the individual nodes to contribute and filter. If individual nodes in the network don't contribute or don't filter information, don't distribute information, then basically those network connections cease to exist. There's nothing else holding them together. So the theory of networked learning recognizes that learning can take place in different spaces, and what that looks like, what it examines is the intersection between human relationships, digital communications technologies, and meaningful collaborative engagement. So the idea of network learning is not to look at the technologies or to look at the connections individually or to look at the collaboration, but to look at how learning takes place through this intersection of those things. And so it's really about those things coming together, rather than looking at evaluating individual aspects of that process. And network learning is informed by connectivism. So connectivism is there's some debate as to whether it's a theory of learning. It's certainly a concept that tries to explain how learning happens in networked environments, and it describes learning as happening through connections between people, sources, and the network. So learning can be held in non-human instruments, and it's through the seeing of the connections and drawing together different ideas and concepts in different fields that the learning actually takes place. The idea of connectivism is that knowledge has a very short half-life, and it is more appropriate to seek out and to learn as needed and through the process of making connections than it is seeing knowledge as something that's sitting in a fixed body that we sort of tip into other people's heads. That learning is an active and socially engaged process. and it involves cultivating and nurturing the network and depends on a diversity of opinions and the currency of information. So it's essentially saying that no one source can be the entirety of knowledge, that it's through the connecting of different sources together that learning takes place. So, drawing upon these theories and these concepts, the theoretical framework that this research was situated on understands that knowledge is distributed and socially constructed, that learning is an active process that's driven by the learner, that it's not teacher driven, it's driven by the learner, that the learner is autonomous and driven by their own goals, which is, it sounds like a little bit of a contradiction because in one sense we're talking about social learning and connections and collaboration, and yet we're talking about the learner being autonomous. That's because the learner is the one who's initiating the learning and driving the connections that are being made for the learning to happen. And finally, the role of social technologies or social network platforms and other digital technologies that allow the connections to be made is basically, it is to enable those connections and spaces for learning. So that's the theoretical framework that this research sits upon. So why did I decide to do this particular research now? So in my PhD, when I looked at teachers' experiences of personal learning networks, that began in 2016 and went through till 2019. And I think we all realize that the world that we live in and the networks that we connect with and the digital technologies that we engage with have changed quite dramatically as a result of the global pandemic. And I was wondering whether or not experiences engaging with PLNs had been impacted by these, all of the changes that have happened. I also was thinking about the increased demands of university educators to build their understanding of digital pedagogy and the skills to teach effectively in digital environments. So there's a lot of research, and I know that's not really the people that I'm speaking with now who are all very comfortable working in online environments, but in universities in general, there's a lot of research to reveal that when everyone shifted to online learning during the pandemic, that was a huge demand on a lot of university educators, and they had to just suddenly transfer everything into a whole new environment. And they didn't necessarily have any opportunity to develop their understanding of digital pedagogy or even their confidence and how comfortable they felt teaching within a digital or an online environment. So I was interested in that as well. And then finally, I was thinking about how networked learning and my knowledge of what a personal learning network is and can be based on my previous research, how it might actually support university educators' confidence and capabilities. So moving to that digital environment, even though we're not in lockdown anymore and things are returning to having face-to-face lectures and things like that, I don't think we'll ever go back to the time when we don't have that option of offering or of engaging with online learning. I think that's becoming something that every university educator has to become comfortable with. But shifting your understanding of learning and teaching in digital environments is very complex. And it's more than just learning about the tools and more than just learning about the technology. And so I was thinking about how based on my previous understanding of PLNs and network learning, that might actually be a really good way of supporting university educators to build their confidence and capabilities rather than just focusing on providing training for how to use different tools, which is obviously another part of the big picture, but not the only one. So as I've said, my previous research had focused on PLNs and school educators. And since I have done that research, and even during that research, there has been quite a bit of investigation in this area. But the research, even to this point, has basically always focused on school educators. And very little has been investigated in terms of how PLNs might be used in higher education or by university educators. And when there is investigation into this area, it generally focuses on how universities use social technologies in a particular way, or how they use a particular type of technology. So there is research that looks at, for example, how university educators use Twitter for professional learning, or how they use Twitter as a back channel to enrich learning during conferences. Most of the research actually also only focuses on Twitter. There is some other research, but generally it does just focus on one aspect, whereas the personal learning network is about connecting across a number of different learning platforms and connecting with a wide number of different people for different reasons. So rather than narrowed down to one particular platform or type of learning, this is a bit of a broader take, and I wanted to look at that broader take from the perspective of higher education rather than school. So I've been talking about this personal learning network, haven't really explained what it is. Many of you probably already know about it, but the concept, probably already engaged with a personal learning network, but generally for the purposes of this research, PLN is an online network where an individual makes connections with people, information, and resources. And they develop this network strategically. So the reason why some people, you might have heard of it, this concept being referred to as a professional learning network because it's used for professional learning. And very early on, I decided that I would refer to it as a personal learning network because the outcomes of my research revealed that in my initial research that it wasn't just professional learning in terms of content knowledge or pedagogical knowledge. There were other aspects of learning, and that this was really tied to the person and the individual. And so I wanted to make sure that it was clear that this was a personal learning network of the individual that was strategically planned and pursued by the individual, rather than professional learning network, which some people use to describe what's actually a learning community, because it's a group of professionals drawn together. It basically provides opportunities for informal learning. So most engagement with the PLN will happen as a part of an informal learning process. And this research looked at that informal professional learning, but it can be used to support formal learning as well. Oh, so this is an example of what a PLN can look like. So as part of my research, and I apologize that it's so small, but as part of my research, I asked the participants to map out their personal learning network before they had their interview with me. And there was a number of reasons for that. And the first one was that it helps people to reflect on what their PLN actually is prior to me chatting with them about it. Because when I put out the call, I was asking people if they connected and engaged with learning online, but often it's something that is until you actually contextualize it and draw it out to the surface like this, you don't really think about what it actually consists of. So every person's PLN is different, as I said, and every person draws or maps their PLN in different ways. This person, they have used different platforms as a way of organizing their network, but they said that if it was possible, they would have preferred to have just had faces of all different people. And so there was a lot of overlap in their network, and a lot of they talked about how they felt frustrated that their network was really complex and multi-layered, and that mapping it like this, that they felt they didn't have the skills to be able to put it down on paper in the way that it actually exists, and that they'd rather design it like a 3D sort of to demonstrate all the different overlaps and layers. So informal professional learning through a PLN has been described as learning in the wild, which I really like as a way of describing it, because it really is that sort of learning that happens strategically, but also happens at times when you least expect it and in ways that you don't necessarily expect. It's very flexible and quite innovative, because we've always had professional networks and people that we can turn to and ask questions of, and sources of information. But with the advent of social technologies, we can now connect so widely and connect with people of from all different disciplines, from all different backgrounds, from all different cultures, from all different points in their career. You can have a school student contacting a professor, and a professor even learning from a school student. There's so much flexibility and opportunity. And the PLN can stand alone, as I've said, but it can also be used to enhance formal learning opportunities, because once connections are made during formal learning opportunities, they can then branch out into the informal learning that happens through a PLN, and vice versa. So the research questions that guided this study. Firstly, I wanted to look at how university educators understand the concept of personal learning networks, and whether how they described them, and to what extent has the capacity to connect with others through social technologies been influenced by the COVID pandemic. It On the surface, you would think that it wouldn't get influenced at all, because it's online, and that was the whole thing about the pandemic, was that all of our connections suddenly became online. So I wanted to know whether or not that assumption was true, or whether there had been an impact on the way that PLNs operated or existed, or how learning had changed. And in what ways do university educators use PLNs to enhance their understanding of digital pedagogies? And that was basically to look at whether or not people had found that, or could give examples of ways that their engagement with the PLN might have helped them in that shift, or alternatively, if I could find examples of what they were doing that might help other people in that shift to learning and teaching online. So this was a qualitative research study, and I framed it around a case study approach. And with this in mind, I put out a call on social media to get as wide a net as possible for participants, but I wasn't looking for a large number of participants, because I wanted to really investigate the individual's experience and learn. I didn't need to have hundreds of people filling out a survey, because I wanted to understand the individual's idiosyncratic relationship with their PLN and their experiences during the last few years. So I ended up with 5 participants who engaged with a PLN, and I asked them to create their individual PLN maps, and I'll include a few more of those. That one that you saw was one of those through this presentation. And I engaged with semi-structured interviews with them. And each of these academics is from a different discipline. That's one of the really interesting things, is that you can learn lots of different things from lots of different people through your network. So there was a academic from medical science, one from teacher education, instructional technology, business administration, and academic development. 2 of the participants were in the United States. One was in France, one was in Great Britain, and one was in Sweden. So it does, even though it's only a small number of participants, it does reflect the global reach of a PLN, and how people all over the world who work in universities are engaging in this type of learning. So these is a summary, and I'll go through each of these, of the findings and the discussion that I've put together as a result of these findings. So in terms of how university educators understand their PLNs, it became clear that there is a very entangled relationship between people and platforms through the PLN that was really demonstrated that concept of networked learning, where it's about the intersection between technologies and people, and collaborative connections. And also something that came through was quite interesting was that they saw the PLN as a form of knowledge management, and that they learned and felt that their students could also learn through this process of knowledge management using the PLN. So that was something that was quite different to what had come through previously from school teachers. Secondly, when I asked about network learning and the impact of COVID, it became evident that there was quite significant changes in the PLNs, that the spaces and configurations of the PLN for these people had changed and was changing, and also that the pandemic had an impact on their conceptions and their feelings about privacy, authenticity, and identity. And this sort of was indicated through shifting spaces for informal network learning. And finally, when I was discussing with them about the PLN and their knowledge and how an impact upon their use and application of digital pedagogies, it was really interesting to see that it did enhance their digital pedagogical practices, and that there were things that these particular participants talked about that I could see would be useful for supporting others to make that shift and to develop their digital pedagogical practices. So this is another one of the maps that was shared by one of the participants. And I would just want to talk a little bit about this entanglement of people and platforms, and how the discussions that I had with the participants revealed that there's really complex relationships between the social technologies or the platforms and the human presence and the people that are within and that are made accessible through these platforms. So every participant placed a different emphasis on the technology within the network, but they all referred to how there was a connection between you couldn't have one without the other, and different tools, different people, different resources created different learning experiences. So I chose this particular map to demonstrate that, because in this particular map, the participant mapped it out using concepts like tools, communities, and services. And really, when you look at it in tools, like for example, they've got Slack, and then they've got Slack again in the communities, but it's the particular group of people within that Slack community that within that Slack channel that they're talking about. So and then in the services, a lot of these were newsletters or Twitter, but then Twitter really is a tool as well. So you can see how there's so much overlap, and it's quite difficult to differentiate really. And they explained to me that they used the word communities to demonstrate the places in their PLN where they engaged with communication that was two-way, and where there was a lot more knowledge construction, active knowledge construction between themselves and the other nodes in the network, whereas the services they saw as more passive learning and information traveling in one direction. And I thought that was particularly interesting that they used Twitter as that they put Twitter in the services category and saw that as a passive learning source, because so much research and other people who've spoken about their PLNs tend to generally put Twitter as a really central part of their community. So that was really interesting, but it shows how it's really difficult to separate the people and the platforms and the different sources of information and different resources. Even though this person has tried to do that, it's they then had to interpret it and add that layer of language over the top to make the map make sense in the way that they wanted it to. So secondly, a number of the educators talked about the concept of knowledge management through the PLN, and this particular map was very directly related to personal knowledge management. They've even got it in their heading, personal knowledge management and PLN. And this particular person used the model of knowledge management from Harold Jacques and the Seek, Sense, Share process to talk about how their engagement with the PLN and their understanding of a PLN had changed over time. They said that when they first started using a PLN, and this really typifies what a lot of people said to me in my first round of research with school teachers, was that it was about frequently sharing and resharing and making connections through really rapid distribution of information. But then, as time went on, and particularly during COVID, they started to reflect on maybe they should only share, this is a quote, maybe I should only share stuff that has my insight on it, my spin on it, and not just share other people's ideas like a bot or an algorithm. So we don't need, because we do have these bots and algorithms and there's so much information just being randomly shared, it was really interesting that they'd added this layer of knowledge management onto the top, and that someone else also spoke about another academic spoke about digital content curation, and which has a lot of similarities as well, because if you look at digital content curation in its fullest form, and use models like, for example, Beth Cantor's model, you can see that digital content curation is also a process of locating, analyzing, enriching, or editorializing the information before then redistributing. It's not just about collecting, and it's not just about just randomly sharing and pushing information on. It's actually a very measured knowledge management process. And so it was interesting that a number of these people had raised this concept of the personal learning network as a way for them to process information and to process their learning and add to that before they redistributed it. And I think this is of particular interest, this finding, because Gonzalez, who actually works at CSU, I've not met this person, but when I found their research, they come from CSU. They've observed that traditional expectations of uni educators as subject matter experts might be shifting, because just like we found, as you know, as in school libraries, it used to be that there was one source of information. So traditionally at a university, it was the university lecturer or the professor who was the source of information. And that, yes, there were libraries and other sources, but that students came to the university lecturer as the source of their learning. Whereas now the lecturer can be seen as just one point, and there's so many other different sources of information accessible. And so Gonzalez suggests that perhaps there should be a shift to guiding students to build the capabilities needed to manage knowledge and essentially become efficient knowledge managers, and that could be a bigger part of the role of the university educator. And using the PLN as a method of personal knowledge management means that if a university educator is already comfortable using the network as this type of form, it makes it easier for them to develop and pass on these capabilities to their students. So this is the second question, where I looked at the impact of the pandemic. And this diagram, it tries to show that the way that people had described a change or a shift in their network. So in a lot of previous PLN research, the nodes or the points in the network are represented by individuals, whereas this research, it came through quite strongly that there were, rather than individuals in each node, there were actually small communities that were within the nodes of the wider network. So that's where that understanding of community and network and how they're different comes into play, because they would have these small communities that had quite strong ties and that had been drawn together for a shared purpose, and that was now forming a node within their PLN, rather than it being just a series of individuals representing the nodes in their PLN. It's not clear necessarily why that has happened. It could be the proliferation of private direct messaging groups and channels on instant messaging, which never really existed when I was doing, didn't exist in a big way, as those things really came to the fore during the COVID pandemic. People started to use them a lot more regularly. And also it could be that there was that context collapse that happened during the pandemic where learners were invited into university educators' houses. So it became, as everyone connected from their individual location, the context, it wasn't just the public lecture theatre, it was the personal home. And that private environment, even when you have the fake background on, that private environment seeps through. And so it's possible that those ideals of open connectivist approaches that encourage the widest possible engagement have been impacted by these blurred boundaries between professional and personal, and created a desire for greater levels of control over spaces. And that could be one reason why people have why these participants at least commented on this shift in the structure and configuration of their PLN. And the other one was that change in identity and understandings of authenticity and privacy. So it became, there was a theme that came through that people were changing their ideas about digital identity, and that rather than being completely and absolutely open in their beliefs and in the ways that they interact, that they started to see uh, their identity and their privacy as needing to be a multi-layered concept. And one participant described having a split in their academic personality. Another person said that their digital identity was multi-layered. But then there was one other person who reflected what I sort of found in my previous research, where when they said that they like to think they're the same person online as they are in person. So it's not everyone who feels this way, but again, there was that sense of different levels of openness. And I was thinking about how that aligned with the concept of visitors and residents, which is the work of David White. And David White came up with this like matrix where between personal and institutional and visitor and resident, where we engage with different platforms, and in some of them we are visitors, where we leave very little trace, very little track, like we jump onto Google and we jump out again. Now we obviously do leave digital tracks and digital footprints every time we engage with anything digital or online, but we don't sign up necessarily unless we've signed up with Google, obviously, but you don't have to sign up and create an account to do an internet search. And so those sorts of, this is the sort of thing where you jump in, you achieve a task, and then you jump back out. And even if you do have an account, like for example with Facebook, this is David White's map. That they jump in and out for a particular reason. Like they might jump into Facebook to see whose birthday it is, make sure that they've sent happy birthday greetings to the right people, but don't actually spend a lot of time there. Whereas if you're a resident, you feel much more connected, you feel much more engaged, you've got collaborative connections. There's that, it's less of that passive, it's more of that two-way or more communication and engagement. And so I was thinking about how that does demonstrate those multi-layers and different ways that we can interact. We don't have to be, yeah, I feel like a resident in my email box too sometimes. And it was, and so for example, the previous map where Twitter was a passive source, for that person, they may well place themselves as a visitor in Twitter rather than a resident in Twitter. So yeah, just those shifting spaces for where informal network learning was happening was quite interesting. And then finally, I don't know if I'm still got time. I don't know, I'm probably running very short. I'm nearly at the end. Being able to personalize and enact agency over the professional learning is what is really important, I feel, to support educators. And they've been found to be bruised by having to respond to the disruption and the transition to online learning. So the support that the PLN, no worries, Louise, thank you. The support that the PLN offers is quite interesting in supporting educators to develop their digital pedagogical skills. So the implications of this research is that even though the PLN is obviously continually changing and that there has been impacts of COVID and things like that, there is a lot of potential for informal network learning to enhance the teaching practices of university educators. And I'm really interested to potentially investigate the connection between the PLN, knowledge management and information literacy, and that idea of shifting student needs, and whether or not the and that really does link in with the library focus, which is quite interesting. So yeah, I've got a reference list here if you want to scan it or link to it, because it was way too long to put on the slide. So thank you. If you've got any questions or want to discuss, I'm happy to do so, or any feedback or suggestions.
Thanks, Kay. Didn't spot any outstanding questions in the chat.
No, I didn't. I was looking too.
Anything they wanted to pose to Kay?
I have a question. I have a number of questions. First one, really basic one. You know that first map you showed of someone's network, and it was all those little pink lines?
Yeah, this
What
one.
software is that? That looks really...
That is Miro, which they are using in the leadership. It's actually really cool software, and I want to start using it in my with breakout groups with students. It's like a mind mapping tool, but it's collaborative like Google, so you can, like Google Docs, so you can collaborate. Miro.
Is it
free? It has a huge environment. Yes, I think you can pay, I think, but a lot of it's available free. There's lots of environments. There's heaps of proformas that you can use. So you can create a proforma and then have students come in and interact within that proforma.
Thank you.
Collaboratively. It's really cool.
And my real question, you know how all this is sort of so dependent on IT and networking tools?
Yes.
What happens when something like what's happening with Twitter at the moment, when Twitter goes belly up? Because what happens? Are the networks strong enough to survive a big migration like that, or do they fall apart? What happens? Do you have any idea of that?
I haven't done any research on that, and I haven't seen a lot of research on that, because most of the research is just at this sort of stage of talking about what it is and understanding how it works and things like that. I think that my immediate response would be that yes, some connections in networks survive and others don't. And it really, because it's so idiosyncratic and it's so dependent on need, there'd be a lot of people who connect on Twitter now, but it's just habit. And so if Twitter falls over and they shift to, and some people shift to Mastodon, those people who've just been connecting out of habit might not make that shift to Mastodon.
Yeah.
I've noticed a lot of people commenting on Twitter at the moment saying, I'm not shifting to Mastodon because I couldn't be bothered, because I have spent years developing my networks through Twitter and other sources. And I know that if it falls over, I'll have to start it from scratch again. And I just don't have it in me anymore. So, but not everyone's going to feel that way. And it depends on how much you feel you depend on or need your network as well. Because if you really rely on it quite frequently, then you're going to go ahead and make those connections again because you feel like you need to.
Yeah, you've got to benefit. Yeah.
So it really depends on the individual's motivations and not even just their general motivations, but their motivations for each individual connection as well.
Do you think a network would behave differently to a community in that regard when their IT breaks down? Yes,
I think a community, not every single community, like nothing's set in stone. And some communities are closer to networks and some are, but it's a tightly connected community would probably find another platform and shift to that, because the technology is not the driver as much as it is in a network. The community is drawn together because of the goal or the reason that the shared interest or the learning goal, whereas the network is about the individual meeting their individual needs. So the network like this map that's right in front of us now, if that was all based in Twitter, which it isn't, but if that was all based in Twitter, it would be very unlikely that you would just pick that up and plonk that somewhere else. But these individual communities, like they've got here, PhD Life Raft Circle, and that's in Slack. If Slack fell over, they would probably take their PhD Life Raft and move it over to a different platform because it's a tighter community. Whereas this whole thing would not just holus bolus
shift. Thanks, Kay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I was actually wondering, that discussion of Twitter, I wonder if there are clever software people somewhere trying to build a tool that lets you migrate your Twitter networks to other.
You wouldn't really be able to, because that's the whole reason why you can't take this network and shift it over, because if you know, each individual needs to shift to a different platform and then recreate the connections again.
Well, that's what I mean. Could you automate that? So there we go. Crystal's saying in the chat, that's what I was imagining. If you had your Twitter handle in your Mastodon profile, then you could get an application that mines all the people you follow on Twitter, searches Mastodon for them, and then recreates it in Mastodon.
If they're in Mastodon, yes. If they're in Mastodon. But Mastodon is not like Twitter, because they're all on different servers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
although some people are attempting to do that with, I've seen a couple of people putting together huge Google Docs where people can contribute their Twitter handle and their Mastodon, whatever you call it, name, and then that is your network within that Google Doc, and then you can pick and choose who you want to join with.
Although, and some people would consider that to be their personal learning network, but in terms of from a purist perspective, Twitter or that platform, that's only one platform within it. You could have a network that transverses lots of different platforms. Like this has got YouTube and Scholar and Yammer and Teams and blogs and WhatsApp and Slack, and that's the whole. It is a network within a network kind of thing, the network that you have on Twitter.
Yeah, you could redraw that diagram along the lines of one of your last diagrams where you had those little blobs with little networks within them.
Yes.
You could just redraw
this one. Yes, you could. But then there's also overlaps as well, because like someone that's in the PhD Life Raft network might also be on Twitter.
So that's an entanglement.
Entanglement. And some people will communicate with they'll communicate. Say this is Sally, and Sally is in Twitter, and Sally is in that particular small DM group. Some people might only connect with Sally in the DM group when they're talking about one thing, and then Twitter when they're talking about something else. But then other people might relate to Sally. Just doesn't matter where they are, just as long they want to talk to Sally. So they'll just, you know, there's so much entanglement. That was the idea of the fact that you can't separate the person and the technology. And that helping academic educators to understand that might help them relate better to students when they're working with them in online spaces.
Very interesting. Hard to draw.
Yes.
And I guess that speaks to the old digital visitor versus resident distinction. I'm interested, like, the extent to which you think that model or characterization is still relevant. It seems like it sort of speaks to me a little bit of a slightly older way of thinking about the web and web applications, right? Because there's been so much consolidation that it's often the same companies that own multiple ones of these. So, and like the Google isn't really Google would like to think that isn't so much about individual Google applications, but a Google ecosystem.
Yep.
So you're not accessing your Google Mail and Google Docs, but you're in Google all the time, and you're if you're using WhatsApp or Instagram or Facebook, you're within the Meta universe, and the data is being passed out. So I know that there are distinctions around the kind of networks you can create within some of those, but I don't know, it seems like it could be ripe for a rethink. I'm guessing there's people already doing stuff like that.
Well, David White's still working in that area, and like that model of visitors and residents was 2011, but in the open networked learning course that I've been participating in for quite a few years, but that I've now ended my association with. David is one of the, I'm a presenter for one topic, and he's a presenter for another topic. And he uses that obviously it's his model, so he wants to keep it going as long as possible. But he uses that to introduce, because the academics or the university educators in this course, a lot of them have very limited understanding of digital ecosystems and online engagement and open network learning. And so he uses that to explain to them how we can engage in different places and for different reasons and in different ways. So it's not so much about categorizing. It was developed in a response to the idea of the whole digital native and digital immigrant thing, that was fixed, that you were a native or you're an immigrant, whereas visitor and resident was a way of enacting and connecting and being that changed and moved across a continuum. So I'm not defending the model. I agree that there would be opportunity to update, because anything developed in 2011 is going to need, things have just changed so drastically since then. But that's how David is using it at the moment to explain to new users or to people unfamiliar with these concepts.
Actually, I'm just remembering, I was at a conference where he presented. It was Lynn Conaway as well did work on this with him originally, I think, didn't she, from OCLC? I seem to remember being... Yes,
but Cornu is the person that he mostly does work with, I think. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
So yeah, thank you all for coming. And if you do have any feedback or suggestions or how I can improve for next week in Adelaide, that would be warmly accepted.
I think it's great.
Yeah, it looks great, Kay. Love the visuals.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I tried to make it at least a little bit pretty so that it was something interesting to look at.
Kay's presentations are always pretty and made me think I should spend more time on my presentations.
Maybe I shouldn't spend
Nothing
as much
wrong
time.
with 3 bullet points of text, Kay, from time to time.
Snore.
I just try to use color coding and things like that so that people can follow what I'm saying.
Nice.
It'll never catch on. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kay. Yeah, excellent presentation, and good luck with your conference presentation.
Thank you so much.
All right.
See you later, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.
Join us in December for Jane's seminar.
Woohoo!
Lots of pictures.
Yay!
Yeah.
Bye.